Thank you so much, Professor Kshitij Srivastava, for those very kind words. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sonia Nityanand, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Apijit Kaur, Dean Academics, Professor Amita Jain, Head of Department of Neurosurgery, Professor B.K. Ojha, special guests, Dr. B.K. Acharya, Dr. Raghuveer Srivastava, distinguished members of the faculty, there are so many of them, Madam Devika Nag, she was, I don't know ma'am, long time ago when I was doing my residency, Professor Gauri Devi introduced me to him, me to you, and also Manjari also, both of us were introduced to you. It was really an honor that you could come for the oration today. Professor Mazhar Hussain, Professor Piyush Mittal, so many of the senior dignitaries, apologies if I'm missing out somebody. Distinguished members of the audience, it's indeed a great pleasure to be here. The topic I would like to orate upon does seem a bit intriguing, and the oration may be a bit different. But as I speak, hopefully I should be able to convince you regarding the strength of this oration. A sense of apprehension does fill myself when I realize that I now stand upon the shoulders of these two giants, and whether I would be able to justify the oration on whose name I would be delivering today. A few acknowledgements are in order. My humble salutations to this great teacher, Professor B.S. Das, late Professor B.S. Das, who is no more unfortunately, who was my teacher and mentor when I joined my neurosurgery at NIMHANS. He was a person of many traits, a wonderful surgeon, a wonderful clinician, a wonderful human being. But there are some sentences which stand out, particularly the one which is written at the bottom, you may not be able to see. And he used to often quote this, about the story about somebody asking a wise man that what should I become when I grow up? And the wise man answering, be a good human being. There is very little competition in this area. I'm forever indebted to these great teachers, Professor P.N.TONDON, Professor A.K. Banerjee, even though I have not been directly trained under Professor Tondon and Professor Banerjee. But I was so fortunate to come over to AIIMS, and then I felt as if I was connected with them forever. And then, of course, I would like to acknowledge Professor Mehta, Professor Sharma, Professor Mahapatra, who have been my, in a technically senior colleagues, but actually they have been my mentors and my teachers. I cannot proceed without acknowledging our department, without whose support much of this work would not have been done. We are now quite big. This is an old photograph. We are now 27 of us. A few words of gratitude to my parents, my wife. She's managed the home front despite a busy schedule, my daughter, for taking care of herself. And of course, I truly believe that there are always divine forces, and I really thank them because whatever you do, whatever you are, there are always divine forces behind you. And with this, there is a small disclaimer that I'm not an expert, but an humble traveler like you. And I'd like to take you in this fascinating journey to find new cheese. And what is this new cheese? A majority of my lecture is based upon this book. It's called Who Moved My Cheese by Dr. Spencer Johnson. May I have a raise of hands on how many of you read this book? Well, thank you, ma'am. That's a bit of a spoiler. I was hoping nobody would have read it, but I see majority of you have not read it. So fundamentally, it's a story about two mice and little people who used to live in a hypothetical cheese station C. So every day they would come to the cheese station by 9 a.m., they would eat cheese, gossip, do their work, and then go back by 5 p.m. And soon they started thinking this would go on forever. And it's starting to sound very familiar, isn't it? And each of them had a different personality. So we had a person called Hem, who didn't like any changes. So whenever there used to be any change, he used to say, it's not fair, I don't like any changes, I want everything to be absolutely constant. And then there was another person called Haw, who was startled by change initially, but then he used to kind of become flexible, accept it, and finally go ahead with the change. And then we had these two unique characters who were actually mice, Sniff and Scurry, who would, in a split second, go ahead and embrace the change. So they would not be afraid of any kind of change. So one day, the cheese runs out in the cheese station. What happens now? Sniff and Scurry don't even hesitate. They immediately move out of the cheese station. They immediately run ahead and they say, there's no use waiting here, there's no cheese here. We're going to search for new cheese. Haw is afraid. He stays for some time. He says, should I go, should I not, should I go, should I not? And then he finally says, I have to go, let me go. Hem says, no, I'm going to stay back. It's not fair. I'm going to approach the union leader, I'm going to approach the state authorities. The cheese has to come back. It's my right to have cheese back in this tea station. This is a story about how. So each of us have some element of all these personalities within us, but at some point we embrace change and we move forward, because change is the only constant thing which happens in our life, whether it's professional, personal, everything is changing all the time. And I do also feel somewhat similar to how. Yes, we are all apprehensive about changes, but when they happen, when we embrace it finally, we really feel good. And this is an example of a carpal tunnel syndrome, endoscopic carpal tunnel set, which I developed more than 25 years ago when I joined at AIIMS. And I used to do a lot of carpal tunnels at that time. It was a disposable, low-cost endoscopic carpal tunnel set. And this is how it used to look like. I still have it. I still do carpal tunnels with it. We did more than 500 cases, published a paper. I said I should patent it, so we went ahead and patented it. We even got it commercialized. It's available in the market, but it never picked up because there are other kinds of instruments, similar instruments available, and it's not a very common. Nobody actually likes to do, nobody is so much used to this. But it taught me very important lessons. It taught me that intellectual property rights are as tangible as real property. It gave me an essence to what it is to go into innovation, and I enjoyed the process thoroughly. And then I realized that if you need to implement something new, you have to do it as fast as possible, either in form of a patent or a paper. Otherwise, the idea gets stolen from you. So what happens to Haw? Haw comes to a cheese station E, which was empty, but he finds some crumbs of cheese over there. He eats it. He finds it very delicious. And then he scribbles something on the wall. And the reason he scribbles on the wall is for his friend, him, to come later and take these clues and also follow him hopefully to a cheese station where there would be more of cheese. And he writes there. The quicker you let go of old cheese, the sooner you will find new cheese. Having cheese makes you happy. So Haw moves further on. Now I've been doing craniovertebral junction surgeries since 1998. Since the time I joined at AIIMS, I was trained by Dr. B.S. Das. And I've done more than 1,400 cases. And we used to do these massive, severe, complex cases, transoral, posterior fixations. And then we had a revolution by Professor Atul Goyal, who described the distraction technique. And this is the old cheese. We would do a transoral. And I was very proud of this, done 15 years, I think more than 20 years ago. And if I would have done it today, I would feel ashamed of myself. And this is what we used to do earlier. And that's what, based upon Dr. Goyal's technique, we furthered it. We created two motions, and we described the technique of DCR. I presented it in great details yesterday. We published a bunch of papers, more than 30 papers in neurosurgery. And then this was a landmark paper in neurosurgery, which was the editor's choice. And then again, in a lot of other journals, we gave a new hypothesis. We found that 80% of the patients in our country have mutations on FV1 gene, and we gave a hypothesis that most of these patients have weak ligaments and sloping joints, and that's the reason they develop bacillar invagination. And some more paper. So we are now in the process of developing this universal reducer. We developed a new implant system. I could demonstrate the new implant system yesterday, and these are the profile of cases which could be corrected by this technique. You could have severe AAD, and they could be easily corrected using this technique. And again, you can see how this universal system could be fixed here and then reduced completely. And again, you can see a very severe AAD with BI and absolutely non-existent cord, again corrected using this technique. So the old cheese was a transoral excision and posterior fixation, but the new cheese is to consider CV junction like a deformity. And the purpose is not only to decompress the spinal cord, but also to reduce the deformity and also to realign the spinal cord. So what happened to Haw? Haw wondered at some point of time, he was overwhelmed by doubt. He wondered, did I make a mistake coming out of the cheese? Maybe the cheese will come back. Maybe I should have stayed back with him. And he was wondering whether he should go back. But then finally he decided to move in a new direction, and he felt good. And he wrote something on the wall for his friend Hem. Movement in a new direction helps you to find new cheese. So I have been associated with epilepsy thanks to my wife Manjari. We have started a very successful epilepsy surgery program for the past 23 years. It was mentored by Professor Satish Jain and then Professor Manveer Bhatia, and then we took over. And we used to do hemispherectomies, which used to be highly, it's a very effective procedure. And it is done for children who have drug-resistant epilepsy arising from the whole hemisphere. And it's one of the most effective surgeries. It has almost a 90% success rate. But the fact is the surgery is highly invasive. It's maximally invasive and highly morbid because it's usually done in kids who are 4 or 5 years old, and you need to physically remove one whole hemisphere. And then we thought this is not right. You have kids, and then how can you do such a major surgery? And that's when we started thinking of whether we can introduce an endoscopic technique to reduce. And we worked upon cadavers. We worked upon this for almost 10 years. And then for the first time in the world, we developed an endoscopic technique through an opening of just 3 into 4 centimeters. So this was published in Neurosurgery. I put the scale on purpose because it shows made in India on the scale. So this is a made in India technique. And we published, thank you. We published a bunch of papers, more than 20 or 30 papers, including the highest impact factors. And it came into textbooks, including the textbook of epilepsy by Professor P.N.TONDON, which is considered as a Bible for epilepsy. And now it's been practiced in several centers across the world. Just to show the example of the minimally invasive nature of this technique, this is a left hemispheric cortical dysplasia, and you can see this fine disconnection of the hemisphere. So we disconnect the hemispheres, we do not remove the hemispheres physically anymore. This was a patient I operated in Malaysia, again having a very severe anomaly called as hemimegalencephaly. Endoscopically done, patient lost only 40 cc of blood. She was having more than 200 seizures a day, became totally seizure free. And these are some of the papers which we published. And based on this, we created another new technique for the first time. We described an endoscopic technique for division of corpus callosum along with commissurotomy. So the use of endoscope along with commissural sectioning was used for the first time for a condition called as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. It's a very severe condition. The child has as many as hundreds of drops per day. So the parents put the child on a helmet, and the child keeps on having repeated falls and injures himself or herself. And using this technique, we were able to provide 100% relief of drop attacks and about 50 to 60% relief of other seizures. Just to show this is a child of a mother, very young mother. She was hardly 19, who came from the war-torn Yemen. Her husband was killed in war. Her whole family was killed in war. And the child was having hundreds of seizures a day. She came to India. She was going around to Mumbai, to Bangalore, and finally she came to Delhi. And we did this technique, the endoscopic division of corpus callosum with commissurotomy, and the child became seizure-free. And because of her very unique aspect of her coming to India and all that, it was published in papers, not for the surgical technique, but how she managed to survive and come to India. And now it's been followed up in a lot of other publications are coming up, and it's being followed up in various places. Now Lamb Sandy is doing it very aggressively. So this is how it is done. We use an endoscope, we retract the hemisphere, we go into the interhemispheric fissure, we identify the corpus callosum, we start dividing the corpus callosum, go up to the splenium, we enter the ventricle to the genu. These are the A2s. Apologies if I'm running it a bit fast. Then we start the anterior disconnection, go right up to the skull base, and then go laterally to the caudate head, thalamus, and basal nucleus. Again, go down up to the skull base, and then finally finish with the posterior disconnection. So through an opening of just 3 into 4 centimeters using an endoscope, it's possible for you to disconnect the entire hemisphere. We presented this at the plenary session of AIIMS, and it provided a new hope for children. And then, of course, it came into the chapter of Professor by John Stern. He's a director of Epilepsy Center at UCLA, a very good friend of mine. And then he came for this workshop in Banaras, and we went together for having this famous Banaras chart. And during that time, I was asking him, because I was thinking of a new idea, and asked him that, John, do you think it's possible to create a bloodless surgery for hemispherotomy without losing a single drop of blood? And John already knew about my endoscopic technique. So he said, okay, bloodless, maybe you will use a thinner endoscope. At that point, I realized that old beliefs do not lead you to new cheese. If you need to create something new, you have to think in a totally diametrically opposite new direction. And then we did it. We created the world's first bloodless hemispherotomy. And how did we do it? We used this robotic system. We used multiple electrodes. and we created an hemispheric radiofrequency ablative disconnection. So you can see this disconnection. This disconnection is produced by radiofrequency ablation. And it came out in papers also because it was it was quite a revolutionary technique and came on the cover page of JNS. And for me professionally, it was like moving from an era where we used to produce a hole in the brain to just a line in the brain where you don't lose any blood. We call this a ROCH. So this is how it is done. We put multiple electrodes, provide an hemispheric disconnection. You can see the hemispheric disconnection here. And we do it through multiple holes, twistrils, and we just put sutures. So, and again, another patient who was operated at 6 months. You can see once the sutures are removed, you can't even make out where the surgery was done. In fact, the GP who referred this patient, he called us up. He says, Doctor Sahab, bataiye kya operation kiya? Hame to kuch dikhai nahi de raha operation. And again, you can see this beautiful hemispheric disconnection. We have done, now this has become the sole procedure of choice in our institute. We have done it in more than 25 cases. And this is how we do. We fix it to a robotic system. We make a twist drill. We calculate the target. We put an electrode, start the radiofrequency ablation. We calculate the impedance so that we know where we are exactly in the target. I'll mute it. And then we also fuse it with CT scan and MRI to ensure that we are exactly on the target. And I'll just come to the end when I am removing it. I just want to show you that when I remove the electrode, of course we put in electrodes multiple places and we have multiple markings. So we go on serially burning it. It requires about 100 burns. So when we remove it and we inject glue so that there's no CSF leak, and you'll find that there is actually not a drop of blood coming out. So for sake of modesty in the papers, we mentioned less than 5 ml. But the fact is, there is absolutely no blood loss. And we just put a single suture. We then tackled this very complex pathology called hypothalamic hamartoma, where you have this hamartomous lesion in the base of hypothalamus, and the children present with gelastic epilepsy. So they keep on laughing. It's mirthless laughter. So that's not genuine laughter. It's actually epilepsy. It's form of an epilepsy for the undergrads sitting at the back. So the options which are available are either open surgery or gamma knife. None of them are very effective. So again, we created a robotic technique for radiofrequency ablation, again for the first time. And you can see that what we do is basically we disconnect this hamartoma from rest of the brain using this robotic technique. And this is a published work on hypothalamic hamartomas. So what happens to Hav? Hav was very afraid of new corridors, but he overcomes his fear and then he plunged into the corridor. There was enough cheese in the corridor to keep him going. And he realized something at this point of time and writes it down for his friend Hem. It is safer to search in the maze than to remain in a cheeseless situation. So we go ahead in our journey. We devised a new retractor for endoscopic pituitary surgery. I always felt most of the instruments provided by the companies are not required. And I was also not in favor of this bimanual technique because it's not minimally invasive. You can end up producing severe atrophic rhinitis. And then we devised this retractor, which I called as Easy Track. And you can introduce this retractor in the submucosal plane. So you just retract the mucosa on one side and go transseptally. And the surgery carries on like the usual surgery. You access the sella, you remove it, you open the sella, you start removing the pituitary tumor. And in the end, once we remove the retractor, we just suture up the mucosa. So we don't have to put any nasal tamponades. We just put a stitch on the mucosa and that is it. And this is the kind of tumors you can remove. Large cranial, we had to stage it, but we removed it completely. That was a small unofficial function in one of the conferences in Jabalpur where we inaugurated. And then we went ahead and did something for vertebral hemangiomas. So vertebral hemangiomas are treacherous tumors. They can bleed. If you touch them, they can bleed. And the treatment available is you can do embolization, which can cost significant. It cost a few lakh rupees. And then we introduced a technique of absolute alcohol embolization with short segment fixation. So you can see we injected alcohol in this patient, severe compression, and after that you can see the compression is completely removed. It's a cure. And we published the following papers. We published more than 10 papers now. I'm showing the most seminal papers. And it costs less than $2 US. It's hardly 40 or 50 rupees. So we have reduced the cost. And this was a lady who was wife of a reporter who was 7 months pregnant. She was paraplegic, had a vertebral hemangioma, and we cured her. We gave her absolute alcohol injection. She started walking. She came walking. And her husband was very, very fascinated. He was fascinated by not because she started walking, but by the fact that alcohol can actually cure tumors. So he was asking us, Dr. Sahab, agar hum alcohol piye to tumor theek ho jayega. But anyway, he published this in the paper. So what happens to Hav? Hav found the darkest corridor and he felt afraid. But yet, when he took the plunge, he felt afraid. He also realized something and wrote on the wall, when you stop being afraid, you feel good. And this was my darkest corner. To get into a realm for which I was not used to, and then to take a project from the Government of India, from Department of Biotechnology. So when we were doing a postdoc in UCLA, I worked under Dr. Gary Mathern, and he was a superb surgeon, but he also had a research lab with him. And I found that most of the surgeons abroad, they could be excellent surgeons, but they have research labs with them. They have research scientists working with them. So I found that the dichotomy, the perceived dichotomy that good surgeons cannot be good researchers, which exists in India, doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. So why should it exist here? And taking Gary's help, we wrote up a project which was 1,000 pages. We gave it to Professor N.K. Bhan, and it was lying for almost 3 years, was reviewed several times, and finally we got the project. And for that, I'm very grateful to Professor N.K. Bhan, Dr. Gary Mathern, even Dr. P.N.TONDON. He was so excited when I told him I want a research lab. He corrected each and every word of that 1,000-page article, and he pursued it. And we have these four verticals. We have a first of magnetoencephalography in India, along with an epilepsy surgery and a neurology unit, with a neurobiology lab, where we have scientists who can put electrodes into individual neuronal cells, which is called as intracellular electrophysiology. So we give live tissues, neuronal tissues within 15 minutes, and they put into live neurons, and they do recordings of the voltage. Using MEG, it's been done in more than 2,800 cases. We can do it for free or for just 3,000 rupees, and if Dr. Roja can send us cases, we'll be very happy to start their epilepsy program here. And we started using very advanced algorithms in order to detect the networks. And then we started the first SCEG system in India. We have implanted more than 537 electrodes. And we do it for cases which are completely MRI negative. So the localization has to be done by introducing electrodes inside, and we use the robot to introduce electrodes. So we record seizures spontaneously in these patients. Then we stimulate the electrodes to produce habitual seizures, and then we burn the electrodes to see if the seizures are reducing in frequency. And using that, we were able to achieve 71% seizure freedom in temporal and 53% in extratemporal sites. And these are the patients where MRIs are absolutely normal, and they have several seizures per day and per week without any treatment. So for them, we've been able to achieve the treatment. And this obviously was cream. It was an icing. I mean, it's not my credit. It was basically, but yes, I was associated being the surgeon. But it was a great sense of satisfaction because for the first time in an RCT, we showed that children who undergo surgery have a 10-fold improvement as compared to children who do not undergo surgery. And the best part is, it has influenced the insurance policy in a country like US. So following our paper, the insurance companies in US now mandates that any child having drug-resistant epilepsy has to be referred to an institute and not with a general practitioner. These are some of the papers. Dr. Kshitij was very kind enough to tell that I have more than 100 publications in basic sciences, but the credit doesn't go to me because like surgeon, I don't understand a lot of these things, but we were able to develop a team of researchers and they published these papers. So we have more than 200 papers in very high impact factor journals, some of the papers. So this is it's an impact factor 11 where we published our data on MEG. And then we described a new molecule for epilepsy called KYNA. Again, we published it in impact factor 12 journal. So fundamentally, what is cheese? Cheese is a metaphor for what we want in life, whether it's a job, a relationship, a money, a big house, freedom, health, recognition, spiritual peace, and even an activity like running or baseball. And each of us have an idea of what cheese is and how we want to pursue it, and how we believe that it would make us happy. If we get it, we become attached to it. If we lose it, it could be traumatic. it happens most of the time. Maze is a place where we spend our time to look for cheese, or what we want. It could be an organization you work, relationships you invest in, or even the community you live in. Sometimes the corridors are filled with delicious cheese, and sometimes you end up getting into dark, blind alleys. Sometimes you could be even hurt by predators. So it's a variable situation. I've been very fortunate enough to have worked in a maze like this for the past 25 years. And the whole credit goes to this place, to the maze, not for me. I was just a humble mice going along, and I found a lot of cheese there. And I'm honored to be in a beautiful maze like the place where I'm giving oration from. And yes, sometimes you get into dark corners. And when you do, you make sure that you have a lot of good friends and family who can support you and help you during these times. So what happens to Haw? In the book, they say that Haw finally gets to the cheese station N, where he finds Sniff and Scurry, and they have lots of delicious cheese, and it was much more delicious than what they had in the earlier cheese station. But what happens to him? The book is kind of open about him. They don't say whether he's actually followed Haw or he has not followed Haw, but it would lead us to believe that he did actually follow Haw and would have actually made it. But here I would like to ask a question. What if Hem didn't make it? What are the factors which would have prevented him from moving out to search for new cheese? And these factors, I believe, are common to all of us. And I looked up into these factors. And this could be the factors. They look very, again, they look very intriguing. But I will speak about it in a few minutes. And here, I would like to apologize for running a 2-minute video with music. And my apologies. Was put, but the question is, why is it looking more and more like this painting? This is a painting by Walter Jakes. It's called as the Battle of Brightonfield. It shows King Gustav of Sweden in the war, and you can see King Gustav riding a horse with absolute calmness in his face and directing the war almost like a godlike figure, as if nothing has happened to him. And it looks as if he's in total control of the situation. And this is the truth about war as well as surgery. And that was a perception, and this is the reality. You're operating, there's no music here. You're clipping an aneurysm. And here I don't clip the aneurysm completely. It's an IC aneurysm because I didn't drill the clinoid completely. So I thought I clipped it completely. And then when I was dissecting the neck, there was a rupture here. So there are no angels flying above us. So we have to tackle the situation ourselves. And then we readjust the clip and stop the bleeding. And this this surgery looks more like this painting. This is a painting by Tom Lea. It's called as a 2,000-yard stare. He was a soldier in the World War II, and then he paints about this. Now, when you see this painting, you don't have to see the background, you don't have to see the tank, the trees, the skies, you just have to look of horror on the soldier's face. All that he has heard about the war, from that his eagerness to get into the front line, everything dissipates the moment he looks at war on face. So when we join neurosurgeries, we have a lot of unusual expectations. We ask the residents, why do you want to join neurosurgery? They say, it's very fascinating, brain is the seat of soul, it's very complex, I want to learn about it. We have also done the same thing. And the moment you get into neurosurgery, it's non-stop duties, there is no food, no sleep, there are complications, there is shouting in the wards, and that is the 2,000-yard stare. So we need to close this gap. We need to close this gap that this is a perception and this is a reality. We need to close the gap. And that is where we come to acceptance. And that is the first step to cross the barrier. Second step is giving too much of attention to the narrative brain. So this slide was given to me by Professor Tondon about Professor Sperry, who got a Nobel Prize in 1981 because he did studies on divided brains. He did studies on corpus callosum, which was cut, and then he presented different images to different brains. So he presented a snowy landscape to the right brain and a chicken claw to the left brain. And because the brains were not connected, the patient was asked, how do you correlate the both? And the patient comes up with a totally fictitious story called as a chicken claw goes to with the chicken which you need to shovel the snow, which has absolutely no meaning. But the fact that both the brains were not connected, he had to conjure up some kind of a fictitious story. And with this, the psychologists came up with the concept of an experiencing self and a narrative self of the brain. Now, how do they function? They function with the fact that we have just a couple of experiences in the life, and we have a narrative which is built all over those couple of experiences. I have more than 30 years of experience. It starts to sound familiar now. And then we build up a fictitious story over it. And at some point, we forget that the concept of I doesn't exist. And this has been shown by Scott Adams, who described he described the readiness potential. He demonstrated that there is a readiness potential 550 milliseconds even before the person starts thinking that I want to move the arm. And about 300 milliseconds later, the person decides to move the arm. And that brings to the fundamental question of life. Who am I or who are we? As questioned by Ramana Maharshi, who used to believe that we are just an illusion, self is illusion. But if we look at the concept of narrative brain, we are nothing but stories created by our narrative brain. We have a couple of experiences and we weave a fictitious story around the entire few experiences we have and we create a story over it. And this is precisely how psychiatric illnesses are also created. And this was again told to me by my daughter. So you have a huge dichotomy between the experiencing brain and the narrative brain. And that is where mindfulness is coming very much. So you can see in fMRI study how mindfulness helps you to close this gap. So the fundamental objective of this is awareness. So that is the next barrier you need to cross. You need to have awareness. You need to see whether this is actually the truth or it is something which your narrative brain is building up. And finally, we come to the Don Quixote syndrome. All of us have heard of Don Quixote, right? We have read it during the school books. So he wanted to be a knight in shining armor. He was nothing but an aging farmer. And he wanted to kill the giants, which were nothing but windmills. He wanted to win over Lady Dulcinea from the opposite village, who was nothing but an uncouth peasant girl from the nearby village. And he was into these delusions that these windmills were giants. But the question is, what if he had caused a real harm? What if he thought that some person was actually a giant and killed that person? We could have three possibilities. He could be shaken out of his delusions. He would not be bothered. He would just carry on with his narrative self. But there could be a more profound and a more complex and a more dangerous situation. And that is called as "we were always right" syndrome. So just to give an example, in World War, Italy engaged in war with Austro-Hungarian Empire to liberate the cities of Trento and Trieste. And Italian politicians were screaming, saying that we need to win over cities, and they were absolutely sure that they could win over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They went into the first battle, second, third, fourth. They went into a total of 11 battles and lost more than 700,000 people. But the question is, could they have stopped? We have similar situations in neurosciences. Ygaz Moniz described leukotomy in the year 1930, and it developed from a chemical, it developed into a physical leukotomy. We didn't stop there. We didn't stop to analyze. And then came Walter Freeman, who went ahead to do 10,000 surgeries. Several of them had severe morbidity, and many of them died. And it was finally removed from the armamentarium of psychiatry treatment. The question is, could we have stopped there? And the same thing might equally happen to skull-base surgery, extended skull-base approaches, spine surgeries if you're not careful. So the third barrier is insight. So from a surgeon's perspective, the 2,000-yard stare translates into acceptance, which translates for a surgeon to confront your fears. Not giving too much attention to the narrative brain translates into awareness, translates into looking at things objectively. And the Don Quixote syndrome translates into insight and translates to learn early from your complications. So these have been some of our humble contributions. An endoscopic carpal tunnel set, that's how we started. Then the DCR technique for CV junction. 3 minimally invasive techniques for epilepsy, including a bloodless technique, a new retractor for endoscopic pituitary surgery, absolute alcohol injection for vertebral hemangiomas, 3 new areas of translational research for better understanding in epileptogenesis, 1 possible molecule for epileptogenesis. I will close my lecture here, telling you what could be the final frontier where you need to use that key to open the door, having that new cheese. How many of you have read this book? Can I have a raise of hands? So I suggest you read about it. It's called as Blue Zones. And it's been written by this avid cyclist, Dan Bleutner. And he studied certain pockets all over the world where people used to live not only very long, but they used to have a very healthy life. And these pockets were not close to any kind of hospitals or nursing homes. They had a very healthy lifestyle, and they would live up to 95, 100, 110. And then he got very curious. He wanted to study and look at common factors. What could be there for these people? And he came across these 9 common factors. And he suggested that this could be implemented everywhere. You could create a blue zone very well in your organization if you could have this 9 common factors. So the question is, could we create a blue zone in our institution, in our department? Could we do that? Let us look at each of these factors. The first factor is creating strategies which work for you. And for us, the best strategy is a team approach. The second factor is finding a purpose in your life. Keep specific small goals. That's what seems to be working for me. The third factor is get into as much plant diet as possible. I at least know Professor P.N.TONDON who follows it. So he's absolutely fine. He's now 96 years. The fourth factor is try to have a little bit of wine at 5 o'clock. I know one more person close to Professor P.N.TONDON who follows this. Professor Tondon doesn't drink, Professor Banerjee. So he also seems to be fine. Family first. Family is important, but also consider your colleagues like family. The 80% rule while eating. Never fill your stomach completely. Try to move as much naturally as you can. Attend daily rounds. Do it together with a cup of coffee. Create your own interest group and have a spiritual group. It will be very nice if you could do rounds together and have a cup of coffee with your unit members, your colleagues every day. That fits you into the blue zone category. And I will end with this slide. This is the final key to open the door to the cheese station, which has the new cheese. And this is the saying by Sir Hutchison on the left side, and this is something which I conjured over a period of time. And I'll read it again. My apologies if I'm running out of time. From inability to let well alone, from too much zeal for the new and contempt for what is old, from putting knowledge before wisdom, science before art, cleverness before common sense, from treating patients as cases, and from making cure of the disease more grievous than the endurance of the same, good Lord deliver us. I think in the modern era, this would be more appropriate. Moving from competition to collaboration, moving from volumes to value, from individuals to systems, from receiving to contribution, good Lord deliver us to move from I to us. Summarizing, let us remember what matters most is what you do next. And understanding that cheese is all about change. We have change at every minute of our life. Let's learn to embrace and like it. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. That's it.